the boy who breathed revolution. The story of Che Guevara does not begin with gunfire or glory. It begins with the sound of a child struggling to breathe. On June 14, 1928, in the quiet riverside city of Rosario, Argentina, a fragile cry filled the air. His parents named him Ernesto, unaware that their son's shallow breaths would one day echo across continents. From his first moments, life demanded resilience of him. Asthma wrapped itself around his lungs like an invisible chain, forcing him to fight for every breath. A battle that would shape his strength more than any revolution ever could. As a boy, Ernesto often sat near windows, gazing at the sky when the puffing fits subsided. The world outside seemed vast, wild, waiting. His family was well-read, unafraid of ideas. His father, a man of liberal views, and his mother, Celia, educated and fierce in intellect, raised their children to think, to question, to feel deeply. Books piled high in their home, Marx and Neruda, Freud and Cervantes, words that would whisper quietly into young Ernesto's growing mind. Yet, for all his intelligence, Ernesto was not a child of luxury. His asthma kept him from playing rough games, from running freely with other boys. And so, he turned inward. He learned patience, curiosity, reflection. He read not only to escape, but to understand. When pain came, he didn't shrink. He studied it. He wanted to know why the world hurt and why some suffered more than others. These questions became his quiet companions, sitting beside him as he wheezed through the long nights of childhood. When his family moved to Alta Gracia, a small town in the hills, the cleaner air offered some relief. The sun was gentle, the wind cool, and the countryside calm enough for a boy to dream. Here, he watched the farmers, the laborers, the quiet dignity of people who worked hard and earned little. He saw kindness and struggle living side by side. It was there, in Nesbian treat, that pain seemed to wing in public, and all the rest was gone below the surface. Among the hills of Cordoba, that empathy began to take root. Ernesto was no ordinary boy. He was a quiet observer of humanity, a child already beginning to question the invisible lines that divided rich and poor, comfort and hardship. In his teenage years, despite illness, he grew into a tall, determined young man. He learned to play chess with fierce focus, to read philosophy with hunger. He studied medicine at the University of Buenos Aires, a choice that reflected his desire to heal, not just bodies, but perhaps the world itself. His classmates admired him for his sharp wit and his quiet intensity. He could be charming, even playful, yet beneath the humor, something restless stirred, something that could not be contained by textbooks or the comfort of city life. There were nights when his asthma flared so badly that he would sit upright, gasping, his chest heaving in rhythm with the dark. Those nights shaped him, when breathing itself felt like resistance. He learned what endurance truly meant. He learned that pain can be a teacher, a quiet, merciless teacher that forces the heart to grow strong. And so, while other boys dreamed of easy futures, Ernesto dreamed of something greater, though he could not yet name it. His family affectionately called him Tete. To them, He was a bright, mischievous son. To his friends, he was brilliant, if a little intense. But behind that playful grin lived a boy who watched too much, who thought too deeply. Sometimes he would wander into the hills with a notebook, writing small reflections, fragments of poetry, thoughts on love, on death, on injustice. Words became his early rebellion, soft, private sparks of the fire that would one day ignite. And as the years passed, that inner fire grew. Ernesto's body might have been frail, but his will was iron. He had learned the first truth of his life, that to fight the world's cruelties, one must first survive their own. The breath he fought for each night was not just air, it was defiance. And so, as the boy grew into a young man, the winds of destiny began to stir. His books, his lungs, his thoughts, all were preparing him for a journey he could not yet imagine. The revolution had not begun, but it had found its first heartbeat, deep in the chest of a young man who refused to stop breathing. And so, as the night deepened, his journey moved quietly forward, toward the road that would change him forever, the boy who breathed revolution. In the soft evenings of Alta Gracia, Ernesto would often sit on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, his inhaler by his side, watching the horizon fade into gold. The world to him was a living story, full of movement, injustice, and possibility. Though his body was fragile, his mind wandered far beyond the limits of that quiet Argentine town. He read about revolutions in faraway lands, about empires rising and falling, and about men who defied the weight of destiny. He admired them, yet something in him whispered that their wars were not yet over, that their dreams still waited somewhere ahead for another to carry them forward. His mother, Celia, noticed that look in her son's eyes, a strange combination of tenderness and determination. She nurtured it. She encouraged him to think freely, to read fiercely, to care deeply. She would tell him, "The world doesn't change with comfort, my son. It changes when someone refuses to look away." Her words planted themselves deep within him, like quiet seeds. Years later, when he marched through jungles with a rifle slung across his chest, it would be her voice he heard in the silence between gunfire. In his late teens, Ernesto began to see medicine not merely as a profession, but as a calling, a path to ease suffering in a world that seemed to produce too much of it. He entered medical school with an almost spiritual devotion, immersing himself in anatomy, biology, and the mystery of the human body. To his peers, he was brilliant, yet different, the kind of student who could recite poetry one moment and debate politics the next. He was fascinated by science, but it was human pain that truly captured his attention. Every illness he felt was not just a biological failure, but a symptom of something deeper: poverty, neglect, inequality. His compassion was not soft. It was restless, searching, unrelenting. Outside the classroom, he began to move in small circles of intellectuals, poets, and thinkers. Argentina, in the 1940s, was alive with political tension, whispers of change in every cafe, every bookshop. Ernesto listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. He had a way of seeing the world, not as it was, but as it could be. His friends noticed it. That quiet spark, that intensity that seemed to hum beneath his calm exterior. He would often take long walks alone, wandering through Buenos Aires with a cigarette and a notebook, jotting down thoughts about existence, about human worth, about freedom. He once wrote that the life of a single human being is worth 1,000,000 times more than all the property of the richest man on earth. It was not a slogan, not yet, just a line in a young man's journal. But in it lived the first whisper of the man he would become. At home, his illness never left him. Nights were still punctured by the wheezing sound of his lungs, the rasping struggle that had accompanied him since birth. But now, he met it with quiet defiance. He refused to surrender to frailty. He learned to swim, to strengthen his chest, to play rugby despite his asthma, to live with a kind of stubborn grace that made even suffering feel purposeful. It was as if he was teaching himself, day by day, how to endure a larger pain, the kind that would one day come not from his body, but from the world itself. In the hospital wards where he trained, Ernesto saw poverty up close. He saw the faces of those who came seeking help but could not afford care. He treated them as equals, never turning away, never judging. His compassion wasn't sentimental. It was sharp, grounded, revolutionary in its quiet way. He would later say that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. But that love began here, in the sterile halls of a hospital, where he learned that healing was not only about medicine, it was about justice. By the time Ernesto reached his early 20s, the world around him had begun to feel too small. The walls of the university, the safety of home, even the comfort of family, they all felt like cages to a soul that was meant to wander. There was something calling him beyond the horizon, a whisper that told him the answers he sought could not be found in books or lectures. They had to be lived, breathed, witnessed. And so, one night, as he stared out at the dim city lights, he made a decision that would alter everything. He would leave. He would travel across the continent, not as a tourist or a doctor, but as a seeker, a witness to the truth of humanity. He did not yet know that this journey would carve the man known as Che out of the boy named Ernesto. He did not yet know that the faces he would see would haunt him for the rest of his life. But deep inside, something stirred, a longing for purpose that would no longer let him rest. The boy who once gasped for air now sought to breathe the entire world in a single breath. And so, as the night deepened once more, he began to pack his bag, unaware that with every folded shirt, every worn book, he was leaving behind the last fragments of innocence. Ahead lay the open road, the unknown and destiny waiting patiently in the dust of the miles to come. The journey that changed everything. The road stretched before them like a ribbon of dust and possibility. It was 1952, and the world felt young again. Ernesto, now in his early 20s, climbed onto a battered motorcycle with his friend, Alberto Granado, a man of laughter, warmth, and the kind of companionship that makes a long road feel shorter. The machine was nicknamed La Poderosa, the Mighty One, though its rusted frame and sputtering engine often made the name sound like a joke between friends. They weren't setting out to change the world, not yet. They simply wanted to see it, to feel its breath on their faces, to touch the lives that existed beyond the safe borders of home. The air was cool when they started, and the sun had not yet grown heavy on the horizon. As La Poderosa roared to life, dust billowed beneath their wheels, and with it, the boy Ernesto once was began to fade behind them. The road had a way of stripping you bare, of showing who you truly were beneath comfort and routine. It offered no disguise, only mirrors. The early days of their journey were filled with laughter. They raced through the open fields of Argentina, through small towns where curious eyes followed them, through nights under the stars when they talked about dreams that felt too big for the world they knew. Ernesto carried a small journal where he wrote every night by the faint glow of firelight. His words were simple, but his thoughts grew heavier with each mile. "The world changes," he once wrote, "when your heart begins to notice it." As the road wound upward into Chile and beyond, the laughter softened. The people they met were kind, but the poverty they lived in was unrelenting. In the small mining towns, men worked deep underground for meager wages, their hands cracked and blackened from dust. Ernesto watched them with quiet empathy. He treated the sick when he could, offering advice, sometimes only comfort. But what struck him most wasn't their illness. It was their resignation. They had learned to live with injustice, to expect nothing more. He saw children barefoot in the cold, mothers with hollow eyes, and farmers who labored endlessly for land that would never be theirs. The young doctor in him wanted to heal them, but the thinker within him began to wonder if medicine alone could ever cure such wounds. He started to see illness not as a personal tragedy, but as a symptom of something far greater, a sickness in society itself. Their motorcycle eventually broke down, coughing one last protest before dying altogether. Yet the journey did not end. They continued on foot, by truck, by boat, whatever carried them forward. Each step took them deeper into the soul of South America, where laughter and sorrow intertwined like the roots of an old tree. In Peru, they arrived at the San Pablo leper colony along the Amazon River. There, surrounded by men and women cast out by society, Ernesto's compassion deepened into something unshakable. He didn't wear gloves when he treated the lepers, not out of arrogance, but out of belief. He wanted to touch their hands, to remind them that they were still human, still part of the world that had forgotten them. That simple gesture, the warmth of skin against skin, was revolutionary in its own quiet way. It was here, in the fading sunlight of the Amazon, that the lines between doctor and dreamer began to blur. At night, as the river murmured in the dark, Ernesto would write. His journal became a witness to transformation. The words no longer belonged to a curious traveler, but to a man awakening to purpose. He began to see the continent not as a map of nations, but as one wounded body, its veins of rivers, its breath of wind, its heart beating in the people who struggled beneath its weight. His health faltered at times. The asthma returned, cruel and unforgiving. But he pressed on, every breath a quiet act of rebellion. He had learned as a boy how to suffer without surrender, and now that lesson served him well. For each hardship, he found meaning. Each injustice carved another truth into his chest, that the world could not be healed by comfort or distance, but only by standing beside those who suffered. By the time he reached Venezuela, the man who had left Argentina was gone. In his place stood someone new. No longer just Ernesto, the medical student. The seeds of Che Guevara had been planted. They had grown in the dust of the road, in the faces of the poor, in the stillness of long nights beside the river. As he boarded the ship back home, he didn't yet know where his new convictions would lead him. But something inside him had already chosen. He had seen too much to go back. And so, as the ship drifted through the quiet waves, the horizon glowed faintly, not just with dawn, but with destiny. The road had ended, but the revolution was just beginning. The journey that changed everything. The wind carried the scent of salt and earth as the ship moved slowly toward the Argentine coast. Ernesto stood at the deck, silent, his eyes tracing the endless stretch of water. He was returning home, but home no longer felt the same. The horizon ahead seemed too small now, too confined for the man he was becoming. The road had left its mark, not in the dust on his clothes, but in the weight behind his gaze. He had seen suffering up close, and it had burned something new into him, a sense of duty. He thought of the miners who worked until their bodies broke. He thought of the lepers who smiled despite being abandoned by the world. He thought of the children whose laughter carried through hunger. These faces lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. They haunted him gently, like ghosts of truth. Each one whispered a quiet plea, "Do not forget us." When he returned to Buenos Aires, the city felt louder, busier, emptier. The comforts of ordinary life, a bed, clean clothes, a warm meal, now carried a strange hollowness. He had witnessed a deeper reality, one that couldn't be unseen. He finished his medical degree with the same discipline as before, but his focus had shifted. Medicine had been his way to heal individuals. Now he wondered how to heal humanity itself. He began writing letters to his friends, describing what he had seen on his journey. His words were no longer those of a mere traveler. They pulsed with conviction, questioning the order of things. Questioning why some lived in palaces while others had no shoes. Why nations with gold and land still bled in poverty. The division of America into unstable and illusory nations, he wrote, is completely fictional. We are one single mestizo race with remarkable cultural unity. It was a realization born not from books, but from miles and faces and hunger. His family noticed the change. He spoke less, listened more, and carried a quiet tension. Like a storm that hadn't yet broken, his mother worried for him. Sensing that her son's restless mind was no longer content with the simple act of healing, he was searching for something larger, something dangerous. He was beginning to believe that the sickness of the world could not be cured by medicine alone, that it required revolution. When Ernesto met other young radicals in the cafes of Buenos Aires, they spoke of resistance, of imperialism, of the invisible hands that kept their continent divided. They spoke not with hatred, but with hunger, a hunger for justice. Ernesto listened, and when he finally spoke, his words were quiet but certain. He believed that to truly change the world, one must be willing to give everything, even one's life. It was an idea still half-formed, but already powerful, already alive within him. He took another journey soon after, through Bolivia, then Peru again, and up to Guatemala. The roads were rougher this time, the political climate darker. Everywhere, he saw the same story written in different languages, the poor, betrayed by the powerful. But Guatemala was different. There, in 1954, the democratically elected government of Jacobo Árbenz was overthrown by a US-backed coup. Ernesto was there, watching it unfold, watching bombs fall over a city that had dared to dream of fairness. He saw fear spread like wildfire. He saw books burned, people silenced, and hope crushed under boots. And in that chaos, something in him hardened. For the first time, he saw imperialism not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing force, one that destroyed lives to protect profit. His compassion evolved into conviction, his empathy into anger. It was in the ashes of Guatemala that he began to call himself Che, a colloquial Argentine nickname that would soon become legend. When he spoke now, his words carried fire. He said that true revolution could not come through gentle reform. It had to be born in struggle, in sacrifice. His medical bag still hung at his side, but inside him, another kind of healer was emerging, one who sought to cure the disease of oppression itself. Through every night of uncertainty, he wrote, filling pages with thoughts that danced between philosophy and fury. "I will be with the people," he scribbled one evening, "even if it costs me my last breath." These weren't the words of a student anymore. They were the vows of a man stepping into his purpose. And yet, even as his beliefs sharpened, his heart remained strangely soft. He still wrote about love, about beauty, about the quiet moments when the world seemed worth saving. It was this balance, the tenderness beneath the fire, that made him more than a soldier in waiting. It made him human. As the months passed, the winds of destiny began to shift again. In the dim cafes of Mexico City, whispers reached him of a man gathering fighters to free Cuba from the grip of dictatorship. His name was Fidel Castro. Che didn't yet know it, but this meeting would change everything, not only for him, but for history itself. And so, as another chapter of his life opened, he packed his small bag once more. The road awaited him again, but this time it would not lead to discovery. It would lead to revolution. Meeting Fidel, the spark of revolution. Mexico City in the mid-1950s was a place where exiles, dreamers, and rebels from across Latin America gathered like moths to a flickering light. It was a city of restless hearts, of whispered plans. faded posters, and the scent of coffee and rain mixing in the air. For Ernesto Che Guevara, it was both a refuge and a waiting room for destiny. He had fled the chaos of Guatemala, carrying not possessions, but purpose. The city became his temporary home, though his heart was already searching for the next cause, the next horizon where justice might still be possible. He lived simply, sharing cramped rooms, reading by the dim light of kerosene lamps, discussing philosophy with other exiles until dawn. The nights in Mexico were heavy with humidity and conversation. Each cafe table felt like the edge of history, where men and women spoke of freedom not as an idea, but as something they might touch if they dared hard enough. And somewhere in the rhythm of those nights, destiny stirred quietly. One evening, through a mutual friend, Che was introduced to two brothers, Fidel and Raul Castro. They had fled from Cuba after a failed uprising against the dictator Fulgencio Batista. At first glance, Fidel was everything Che was not. Tall, booming, magnetic. His voice filled the room with conviction. His words painted Cuba, not as it was, but as it could be. He spoke of a revolution that would not only free the island, but awaken an entire continent. Che listened, his dark eyes steady, absorbing each word like oxygen. The two men spoke for hours, their conversation stretching deep into the night. Fidel spoke of poverty, of the deeper sickness that plagued Latin America, a sickness of inequality and fear. And somewhere between their words, an unspoken understanding bloomed. They were different, yet made of the same restless fire. When dawn came, Che looked at Fidel and said quietly, "Count me in." It was not a declaration made in haste or emotion. It was the calm promise of a man who had found the cause he was born to serve. From that moment, the doctor became a soldier, not out of lust for violence, but from a need to heal the wounds he could no longer ignore. The months that followed were filled with preparation. In hidden corners of Mexico, they trained, a small group of exiles dreaming of liberating an island across the sea. The air smelled of gun oil and determination. They practiced ambushes, read strategy, memorized maps, and learned to move as one body. Che, though new to the art of war, quickly rose as a leader among them. His discipline, intelligence, and calm under pressure earned respect even from those who doubted an Argentine could fight for Cuba. But beneath the drills and the secrecy, there was something almost sacred in the air, the shared belief that they were not just planning a rebellion, but a rebirth. At night, Che would sit apart from the others, cleaning his rifle with quiet precision. Sometimes he wrote letters to his family, his words filled with both tenderness and resolve. "I am not leaving to seek adventure," he wrote once, "but to fulfill a duty." Their small group, just over 80 men, became a brotherhood bound by hope. They knew the risks. Many would not live to see Cuba again, but none hesitated. Each man carried a piece of the dream, a fragment of freedom wrapped in courage. As the day of departure neared, Che felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the asthma returning, cruel as ever. He could barely breathe some nights, yet he refused to show weakness. To him, illness was no excuse for inaction. He had already learned how to fight the limits of his own body. Now he would fight the limits of an entire system. Then came November 25th, 1956. In the early hours of dawn, the group gathered at the Tuxpan River. Before them waited a small, weathered yacht named Grandma. It looked far too fragile to carry so many men, yet it gleamed faintly in the pale light. A vessel of destiny. They loaded rifles, food, and faith, and climbed aboard. Che stood at the deck, breathing in the salty air, his heart steady. Behind him lay comfort, safety, a life of reason. Ahead lay uncertainty, chaos, and the possibility of becoming something greater than himself. The sea that morning was merciless. Waves crashed over the deck, soaking the men as Grandma struggled through the Gulf's turbulent waters. The voyage was supposed to last a few days. It stretched into over a week of storms, sickness, and exhaustion. Food ran low, sleep was scarce, and every man aboard was tested. But amid the chaos, Che endured, calm, focused, tending to the sick, keeping spirits alive. His body ached, his lungs burned, but his will did not waver. And when at last they sighted the Cuban coast, green, wild, beautiful, he knew there was no turning back. History had chosen its course, and he had chosen his place within it. As the sun rose over the mangroves, lighting the path ahead, the world's quiet doctor stepped ashore, not as Ernesto anymore, but as Che, the comrade, the revolutionary, the man who would change the shape of dreams. And so, with the ocean behind him and the mountains calling ahead, his journey moved quietly forward toward the heart of the revolution. Meeting Fidel, the spark of revolution. The air in Cuba was thick with heat and danger. The men who stepped off the Granma were not soldiers in any professional sense. They were dreamers. And half broken from the journey, of the 82 who had departed from Mexico, only a handful would survive the first few days on Cuban soil. The landing was a disaster. They were spotted almost immediately by Batista's forces, ambushed and scattered across the swampy terrain of Las Coloradas. The dream of a swift revolution seemed to dissolve into mud and gunfire. Che was wounded in the neck during that first skirmish. The pain was sharp, but sharper still was his refusal to give up. When bullets tore through the air, he didn't run. He stopped to help the wounded, even under fire. Blood mixed with sweat on his skin, but his focus never wavered. That was the moment his comrades began to see him not just as a doctor, but as something far more. A man who would risk his life without hesitation for others. Days passed as they crawled through the swamp, surviving on roots and hope. Many died or were captured, but those who remained, just over a dozen men, managed to reach the safety of the Sierra Maestra Mountains. The revolution, it seemed, had survived by a thread. Yet that thread, in time, would become a banner. The Sierra Maestra was wild and untamed, dense forests, steep hills, and rivers that sang through the valleys. It was here that the revolution found its heartbeat. The mountains became their classroom, their sanctuary, and their testing ground. Under Fidel's leadership, the small band began to reorganize, train, and rebuild. They were cut off from the world. But within that isolation grew something powerful: unity. Che quickly became one of Fidel's most trusted commanders. His medical skills were invaluable, but it was his discipline and moral strength that set him apart. He organized supplies, taught reading and writing to illiterate peasants, and enforced strict rules against looting and abuse. To Che, a true revolutionary was not defined by the gun he carried, but by the purity of his actions. "We must be guided by great feelings of love," he once wrote. "Love not for comfort, but for humanity itself." The villagers in the Sierra came to respect and protect the rebels. They shared food, offered shelter, and carried messages through the hills. Che, always gentle with the poor, treated their children, healed their sick, and listened to their stories. In return, they gave him something priceless: loyalty. The revolution was no longer just a movement of men. It had become a movement of people. As the months turned into years, the guerrilla army grew in strength. They learned the land like it was an extension of their own bodies. Every tree, every trail, every echo in the night. Che became known for his endurance and fearlessness. He carried more weight than others, refused special treatment, and punished himself more harshly than anyone else when mistakes were made. His asthma attacks sometimes left him gasping for air. Yet he never stepped back from battle. He learned to fight through the pain, to turn each breath into an act of defiance. In the quiet of the mountains, Che kept a diary. His words were precise, unemotional. The thoughts of a man who understood both the beauty and the brutality of the path he had chosen. He wrote about hunger, about comrades lost, about the weight of command. But between the lines, one could feel something deeper: a growing belief that revolution was not just for Cuba, but for all of Latin America. The Sierra became legend. From the lowlands, whispers spread that a group of rebels, led by a man named Castro, was defying Batista's army, striking from the shadows and vanishing into the hills. Each victory, no matter how small, carried a message. The old order was crumbling. In the evenings, by the dim glow of campfires, Che and Fidel would sit together, mats spread before them, smoke curling through the night air. They spoke not only of battles, but of the world beyond, of freedom, of dignity, of the kind of society they dreamed of building. To Che, the revolution was not a mere exchange of power. It was the rebirth of the human spirit. The bond between the two men deepened. Fidel was the strategist, charismatic, bold, often improvising. Che was the philosopher, analytical, disciplined, and relentless in his ideals. Together, they balanced each other, shaping the revolution's soul. By 1958, The movement had grown into a full-fledged war. Rebel columns marched across the island, liberating towns, inspiring the people. The sound of gunfire echoed across valleys, but so did the laughter of children who had never known freedom before. Hope was spreading faster than fear. Che was given command of the Central Front, a crucial responsibility. He led with a mix of compassion and severity, insisting that every fighter uphold revolutionary ethics. At the risk of seeming ridiculous, he told his men, "Let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love." Those words became both shield and sword. When they finally descended from the mountains, marching toward the plains, the people greeted them with tears and songs. The revolution was no longer just a dream whispered in the dark. It was happening. Batista's regime trembled as rebel forces closed in on Havana. And when, on the first day of January 1959, the dictator fled and the city erupted in joy, Che rode into history beside Fidel, the boy from Argentina, who once dreamed of curing illness, had helped cure a nation's despair. But in the glow of victory, he did not smile for long. For Che, triumph was never a place to rest, only another beginning, a making of a revolutionary legend. The morning of victory smelled of smoke and sunlight. Havana was alive, streets bursting with cheers, laughter, and tears that felt decades old. For the people, it was freedom at last. For Che, it was the beginning of a deeper test. He had entered the capital, not as a conqueror, but as a witness to the dream he had helped bring to life. Yet beneath the celebration, he sensed something fragile. A revolution that still needed to define its soul. He wore his worn fatigues even as new uniforms were offered. His boots were scuffed, his hands calloused, his face still marked by the long years in the mountains. While others basked in the glory, Che walked the streets quietly, observing. The city, once under Batista's iron hand, now looked at him with reverence and curiosity. To many, he was already more than a man. He was a symbol of sacrifice, of unbreakable conviction. The new government began to take shape, and Fidel placed immense trust in him. Che became not just a commander, but a minister, first of industry, then of finance, and head of the National Bank. It was an unusual choice, for Che was not an economist by training, but he had something rarer: moral integrity. He refused luxury, refused salary increases, and lived with the same simplicity he had in the mountains. His office was often bare, except for books, maps, and a few photographs of fallen comrades. He believed the revolution's strength did not lie in power, but in purity, in the example set by those who served it. He pushed himself relentlessly, working endless hours, visiting factories, and speaking to workers face to face. His speeches were not grand or theatrical. They were calm, steady, sincere. He spoke of dignity, of effort, of the moral duty to build a new kind of society, one where no one would go hungry. But beneath the idealism lay tension. The United States, threatened by the growing alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union, began tightening its economic grip. Sanctions, isolation, and threats followed. Che, ever defiant, responded with words that carried both fire and clarity. He accused imperialism of wearing a smiling mask while strangling nations in silence. To him, the revolution in Cuba was not merely political. It was spiritual. A rebirth of human dignity in the shadow of empire. Yet even as he stood before crowds, his heart remained restless. The bureaucratic weight of government, the endless meetings and speeches, began to feel suffocating. He had fought for freedom in the jungle, under open skies. Now he was surrounded by walls, policies, and compromises. The revolutionary who once lived by action found himself tangled in paperwork. Something uniquely Latin American. He envisioned a world where moral incentives replaced material greed, where people worked not for wealth, but for love of humanity. It was a dream, too ideal for the age of power blocks and nuclear fears. Still, he clung to it. His speeches grew more passionate, his writings more philosophical. In quiet nights, he would sit by candlelight, drafting essays about socialism, human values, and the role of revolution in liberating not just nations, but souls. His thoughts carried the rhythm of poetry and the weight of prophecy. He believed that a true revolutionary must become a new kind of human being, one guided not by self, but by conscience. And yet, even as his ideals reached higher, his eyes drifted once again toward the horizon. He began to feel that his place was not behind a desk, but in the field, not in governance, but in struggle. He could feel it deep within, whispering that Cuba was not the end of his path. It was only the beginning of a greater mission, one that stretched beyond borders, beyond comfort, beyond life itself. He started to vanish quietly from public appearances. Rumors spread that he was ill, that he had gone missing, that he was preparing for something. Only Fidel knew the truth. In a letter left behind, Che wrote of his decision to continue the fight elsewhere, to carry the flame of revolution into the corners of the world still chained by oppression. I feel that my duty, he wrote, is not to rest while others are dying for freedom. And with that, he disappeared, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than his words. A making of a revolutionary legend, the news of Che's disappearance drifted through Cuba like a whisper carried on the wind. No one knew where he had gone. He arrived under a false name, hidden by night, alongside a small group of Cuban fighters. The terrain was harsh, the politics complex, and the morale fractured. The local resistance forces were brave, but divided, weakened by mistrust, and lack of discipline. Che tried to unite them. He trained soldiers, taught strategy, and shared stories of Cuba's own hard-won fight. But the mountains of Africa were not the Sierra Maestra. The enemies were many, the allies uncertain, and the landscape unforgiving. Malaria gnawed at his body. His asthma flared in the damp jungle air. Yet, even when fever burned through him, he wrote in his diary every night, reflections not of despair, but of resilience. "I feel alone," he confessed in one entry, "but I am not defeated." He learned painful lessons there. He saw how revolutions could falter, not from lack of courage, and as good men succumbed to fear and doubt. After months of relentless hardship, Che withdrew from the Congo, broken in body but not in spirit. He called it a failure, but even in failure, he found meaning. "You can never truly lose," he once said, "if you have dared to fight for what is right." For a time, he vanished completely. The world speculated. Some said he was dead. Others believed he was living in secrecy, planning something unimaginable. And they were right. For Che was already turning his gaze toward South America once again, toward Bolivia, a land he believed could ignite the continent's next great revolution. He entered the country in disguise, under the name Ramon, carrying false documents and a few trusted comrades. They set up camp in the remote jungles, isolated and invisible. His plan was to train peasants, organize guerrilla units, and spread the movement outward. It was the same seed he had once planted in Cuba, the dream of liberation through unity, through courage, through love. But Bolivia was not Cuba. The people were wary, the conditions brutal. The CIA and Bolivian army had learned from past revolutions, tightening their grip on the land. Che's group faced starvation, disease, and betrayal. Supplies dwindled, morale weakened, and communication with Cuba was lost. Yet Che refused to abandon hope. Each night, he still gathered his men around a small fire, reading from his worn notebooks about Marx, about humanity, about why they fought. To those who followed him, he was not just a commander. He was a father. Radio intercepts revealed their location. One by one, Che's companions fell. Yet he continued to lead, even as his asthma suffocated him, even as hunger blurred his vision. He refused evacuation. "I will fight until the end," he told his comrades softly, because revolution is not one act of one man, but of conscience. By October 1967, the end had drawn near. Surrounded and outnumbered, Che and his small group fought until the last bullet. When he was finally captured, he stood tall despite his exhaustion. His captors expected fear. Instead, they found calm. "I know you have come to kill me," he said quietly. "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." Those were his final words. A day later, he was executed in a small Bolivian schoolhouse. His body, laid out for the world to see, was meant as a warning. But it became something else, an image burned into the collective soul of humanity. His eyes, even in death, seemed to hold life, calm, defiant. eternal. And so, from that moment, Che Guevara ceased to be only a man. He became a myth, a memory, a symbol that could not be silenced, the death that birthed immortality. It was the morning after silence. In the small Bolivian village of La Higuera, the mountains stood still, heavy with fog, heavy with the weight of something unspeakable. Inside a dim schoolhouse, the air still smelled of gunpowder and fear. The soldiers whispered among themselves, avoiding the corner where his body lay. Ernesto Che Guevara was dead, and yet it did not feel like death. His eyes were open, soft, unflinching, almost peaceful. Those who saw them said it was as though he were still watching, still waiting, still alive in a way that defied explanation. They placed his body on a stretcher and carried it through the dirt streets. The villagers followed in silence. Some crossed themselves. Others bowed their heads. The soldiers, uncertain whether to feel triumph or shame, couldn't look him in the face. When they brought him to Valle Grande, they laid him across a stone basin, his arms stretched out, his chest bare, his gaze fixed toward the sky. Photographers came to capture proof of his death, but what they captured instead was the beginning of his immortality. The photographs spread across the world. Newspapers, magazines, radios echoing the same question. Why does he look so alive? The image, hauntingly reminiscent of Christ, showed not a defeated man, but a martyr reborn. His beard still dusted with jungle soil, his hair tangled by wind, his face serene, like a warrior who had laid down his arms only to rise in spirit. To the powerful, it was a warning. To the powerless, it was hope. In Havana, Fidel announced his death to a mourning nation. The news swept through Cuba like a cold wave. Men cried in public. Women carried candles to the streets. Students painted his face on walls through the night. His letter to Fidel, written before he left, was read aloud on radio, his voice echoing through every home, every heart. Wherever death may surprise us, he had written, let it be welcome if our battle cry has reached even one receptive ear. And now, the world was listening. Across Latin America, his legend ignited like wildfire. In Chile, in Argentina, in Nicaragua, young men and women carried his words as if they were scripture. His face appeared on banners, on books, on hearts. He had died, but in dying, he had become the very thing he dreamed of, an eternal call to conscience. His killers tried to erase him. They buried his body in secret, hid the location, silenced the witnesses. But myths are never buried easily. They live in whispers, in stories retold under the hush of night. The villagers spoke of strange lights over the place where he fell. Some claimed his eyes glowed faintly when they last saw him, as if he were looking through them into the centuries ahead. The years that followed turned his image into an emblem. Artists painted him in red and black. The beret tilted, the star glimmering like a promise. To some, it was rebellion. To others, it was romance. But to those who truly understood, it was neither. It was remembrance. It was a reminder of what it means to believe so deeply in justice that you give your life to it without hesitation. In universities across the globe, his writings were studied, debated, sometimes misunderstood, often revered. The true revolutionary, he had said, is guided by great feelings of love. Those words became both torch and mirror, illuminating the ideal, reflecting the cost. His message was simple but searing, that real change demands more than anger. It demands compassion. And as decades passed, his face, that single photograph taken in life by Alberto Korda, became one of the most reproduced images in human history. From protest flags to t-shirts, from murals to music, his presence transcended ideology. He was no longer just a Marxist, a soldier, or a Cuban hero. He had become a symbol of defiance, of idealism, of the human yearning for dignity. But symbols are double-edged. Over time, his image was used and misused, commodified, commercialized, stripped of meaning by those who wore it without knowing the man behind the myth. And yet, even through distortion, something of his truth survived, a pulse that could still be felt beneath the noise. For Che's story was not one of perfection, but of devotion. He was flawed, yes, stubborn, uncompromising, often harsh. But his flaws were born of passion, not vanity. He did not crave fame. He sought purpose. He did not chase comfort. He chose struggle. And in that choice, in a world that often forgets its dreamers, his ghost still lingers, not to haunt, but to remind that every generation must decide what kind of world it wants to inherit. That revolutions do not begin with guns, but with hearts that refuse to accept injustice. And so, even now, when his name is spoken, it carries more than history. It carries a quiet challenge to see, to feel, to act. The death that birthed immortality after his death. The search for Che's remains became a story of persistence, secrecy, and eventual revelation. For decades, the world did not know where his body had been hidden. The Bolivian government had buried him in an unmarked grave, hoping that time would erase his memory. Yet memory, unlike flesh, cannot be buried. Those who had fought beside him remembered. Those who had seen him live knew that his spirit was larger than the earth that held him. In the 1990s, decades after his death, a team of forensic scientists located the site. They exhumed the remains, carefully identified them, and prepared them for their journey back to Cuba. When Che's body was finally returned to Havana in 1997, it was met with quiet reverence. Thousands lined the streets, a river of people whose emotions were neither purely sorrow nor purely celebration, but something in between: gratitude, awe, and the solemn acknowledgement of a life lived fully. He was reburied in a mausoleum in Santa Clara, Cuba, a city that had felt his presence decades earlier when his forces had captured it with strategy and courage. The mausoleum itself was simple, yet dignified. Families, students, and citizens from all walks of life visited daily. They came not just to mourn, but to reflect, to witness the enduring presence of someone who had refused comfort in favor of justice. Che's death had transformed him from man to legend. His writings were published, his thoughts dissected, his strategies studied. But beyond ideology, it was the humanity of Che that continued to resonate. He had lived with empathy and discipline, faced suffering without yielding, and treated every human being, ally or enemy, with a measure of respect that transcended fear. Even today, his image continues to inspire. It is seen on murals, in classrooms, in protests, and on canvases around the world. But the legend of Che Guevara is not just in the iconography. It is in the choices he made: to see injustice and not look away, to act despite danger, to live and die with purpose. His story reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the persistence in spite of it. Che's legacy is a mirror. It asks those who encounter it to consider: how far would you go for what is right? How deeply would you feel the suffering of others? How fully would you commit your life to the ideals that move your heart? He became immortal not because he conquered, not because he won, ... but because he dared to live and die in alignment with his beliefs. And so, from the mountains of Bolivia to the streets of Havana, from photographs to murals, Che's presence remains palpable, not as a ghost in the night, but as a quiet, constant whisper, reminding humanity of the cost of freedom, the weight of conviction, and the power of a life lived deliberately. As the wind brushes the tomb at Santa Clara, as children and soldiers alike bow their heads in thought, the story of Che Guevara continues, a narrative of struggle, compassion, and unwavering purpose, stretching beyond time, beyond geography, beyond death itself. Che's ideals: love, sacrifice, and the human spirit. Long before the mountains of Cuba or the jungles of Bolivia, Ernesto Guevara carried a question in his heart: what does it mean to live a life truly devoted to others? From his earliest journeys across South America, he had seen poverty, and he saw eyes hollowed by hunger, hands cracked by labor, hearts weighed down by oppression. And in those moments, he realized that the true sickness of the world was not only physical, but moral. A disease of indifference, of comfort, of the refusal to act. Che's compassion was not soft or sentimental. It was precise, disciplined, almost surgical in its attention. When he treated lepers in Peru, he did so without gloves, insisting on touch, on connection. He wanted to convey, without words, that the marginalized were still human, still deserving of dignity. That same ethic guided him later in revolution. Even in the heat of battle, he considered the consequences of action. Every decision, every order, was filtered through the lens of humanity. He sought not just victory, but justice. Love, to Che, was inseparable from sacrifice. He wrote often in his journals about the necessity of giving oneself fully, body, mind, and spirit, to a cause greater than personal comfort. The revolutionary, he said, must be guided by a great feeling of love. It was not a romantic love, but a love rooted in empathy, in moral courage, in the vision of a world where no child goes hungry and no man is silenced by fear. That love became the engine of his life, carrying him across continents, through disease, and into the face of mortal danger. Sacrifice was the language he spoke fluently. He renounced luxury, comfort, and safety, not out of theatricality, but principle. He endured hunger in the mountains, illness in the jungle, and wounds in battle with the same calm persistence that had marked his childhood struggles with asthma. Every hardship was not a punishment, but a test, a chance to prove the alignment of his life with his ideals. Yet Che's vision was not abstract. He combined morality with action. Ideals without execution were useless, he believed. That's why he organized guerrilla units, trained fighters, and planned campaigns with meticulous care. Revolution was not a dream to be spoken softly in a cafe. It was a reality to be lived in the dirt, the rain, and the fire of struggle. Every strategy was infused with his belief that the people, the oppressed, were central to change. The revolution did not belong to him. It belonged to them. Education and consciousness were also central to Che's philosophy. In the mountains and villages, he taught peasants to read and write. He shared ideas about equality, justice, and the power of collective action. Knowledge, he believed, was a form of liberation. The mind, once freed, could challenge oppression, resist tyranny, and build a better society. To him, a literate, conscious population was the most powerful weapon of all. But, as a man who measured life in terms of love, sacrifice, and courage, his story is a meditation on what it means to live fully, to act decisively, and to place humanity above self. Che's ideals: love, sacrifice, and the human spirit. Even as the world remembers Che as a soldier, it is his moral vision that endures most profoundly. He believed that courage without conscience was empty, and action without empathy was hollow. His journals reveal a man who weighed every decision, not only for tactical success, but for its impact on human dignity. He often wrote of the need for a revolution of hearts as much as a revolution of power, a transformation that begins in each individual before it can flourish in society. In the Sierra Maestra, Che's teachings extended beyond strategy. He emphasized fairness and justice among his own fighters, insisting that theft, cruelty, or abuse were intolerable. Discipline, for him, was not mere obedience, but a reflection of inner morality. His expectation was that every revolutionary must cultivate an ethical strength equal to physical endurance. To fail in this, he argued, was to risk corrupting the very dream they fought to realize. Education, too, was inseparable from freedom. Che believed that a society could not thrive without informed citizens. In villages he liberated, he organized reading circles, lessons, and discussions about history, politics, and ethics. He insisted that those who struggled to survive must also be empowered to think, to speak, and to challenge the structures that kept them oppressed. Knowledge, he said, was liberation in its purest form, a tool to awaken conscience and ignite change. Even when facing extreme danger, Che's compassion did not falter. In Bolivia, during grueling marches through dense jungle, he tended the sick and injured personally, often giving his own meager rations to the weakest fighters. To him, sacrifice was not symbolic. It was lived in every act of kindness and endurance. Each gesture became a lesson, showing that the revolutionary's path demanded the fusion of moral courage and practical action. His writings and speeches reflect a man constantly reflecting on humanity. He understood that systems of oppression were not only external forces, but also internalized attitudes, fear, apathy, greed. Therefore, his revolution sought to change the external world and cultivate a new consciousness within the individual. He envisioned a society where people acted out of solidarity, empathy, and responsibility, rather than fear or self-interest. Che also recognized the fragility of life. He wrote often about mortality, illness, and the brevity of human existence. Yet, he never allowed fear to dictate his choices. "I know you will kill me," he told his captors in Bolivia. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man. Even in that ultimate moment, his philosophy endured. Life's meaning is measured not in length, but in the depth of one's dedication to justice and love. Through all of this, Che remained remarkably human. He loved literature, poetry, and quiet reflection. He carried a sense of humor, a warmth that drew others to him, and a calm steadiness that inspired loyalty. These traits, combined with unyielding conviction, created the paradoxical figure, both tender and relentless, compassionate and unbreakable. Ultimately, Che's ideals, love, sacrifice, moral courage, and education were inseparable from his actions. They shaped the revolutionary he became and continue to shape the way the world remembers him. His life demonstrates that true change is never purely political or military. It is ethical, spiritual, and profoundly human. And so, his story teaches that the path of courage and conscience is not easy. Nor is it ever complete. It requires constant reflection, steadfast action, and a willingness to embrace sacrifice. Yet in walking that path, one can touch eternity, as Che did, transforming not only the world he fought for, but the hearts of those who follow him long after he is gone. Che Guevara as a global icon, from myth to memory, long after the mountains of Cuba and the jungles of Bolivia, Che Guevara's presence continued to ripple through the world. His death, meant to silence him, instead amplified his voice. Across continents and decades, his image became a symbol, a face etched in memory, a figure of defiance, a call to conscience. But it was not the legend alone that captivated humanity. It was the life behind it, the choices, the struggles, the unwavering commitment to principle that made him unforgettable. In the 1960s and 70s, his photograph by Alberto Corda began banners, posters, and T-shirts. Young people, students, and activists saw in that gaze more than rebellion. They saw clarity, conviction, and possibility. The beret tilted slightly, the star gleaming above his brow, the eyes steady and unwavering. It was a portrait that transcended time. To many, it represented defiance against oppression, hope against despair, and courage against complacency. Che became an emblem of global youth culture, yet his story was more than a symbol. It was a call to action. Movements from Latin America to Africa, from Europe to Asia, drew inspiration from his dedication. They studied his writings, his guerrilla strategies, his reflections on morality and love. And while some appropriated his image without understanding, others carried forward his ideals with the seriousness and ethical rigor he demanded. The paradox of Che's iconography fascinated historians and philosophers alike. How could a man who fought, bled, and died in the jungles of Bolivia become both a saint-like figure and a radical symbol? The answer lay in the purity of his devotion. Unlike many figures of power, Che had no appetite for wealth, fame, or comfort. His life was a study in alignment between belief and action. People felt this authenticity. It resonated deeply in a world too often led by self-interest. Universities taught his philosophy alongside Marxist thought. His speeches were quoted in classrooms, and his writings became a guide for those seeking to understand the intersection of ethics, politics, and revolution. Yet Che's influence was not purely ideological. It was cultural. Artists, poets, and musicians drew upon his image and story, weaving it into murals, songs, and films. In doing so, they made him accessible, tangible, someone who could be both admired and emulated. Even decades later, his global reach remained undeniable. In countries far removed from Latin America, youth would wear his image as a silent declaration: "I see injustice. I will not remain silent." Yet, Che's true legacy went beyond clothing or posters. It was in the courage to act, the refusal to compromise on principle, and the willingness to endure suffering for the sake of others. The symbol became a mirror, reflecting not only rebellion, but responsibility. But Che's myth also prompted reflection and debate. Some criticized him as a revolutionary who embraced violence. Others argued his ideals were unattainable or romanticized. Yet even these criticisms could not erase the ethical core of his life. He lived consciously, acted deliberately, and carried an unwavering moral compass, making choices that few would dare. That tension between myth and reality, critique and admiration, only solidified his place in history. Through it all, Che remained human in memory. His letters, diaries, and speeches he was a lover of poetry, a thinker, a teacher, and a friend. His humanity was inseparable from his heroism. It was this combination, fierce dedication coupled with empathy, that ensured he would never be forgotten. And so, even as his face appeared on walls and screens around the globe, the essence of Che Guevara endured quietly, persistently, like a flame protected from the wind. It was a flame that reminded people everywhere, the cost of conscience is high, but the reward is a life that leaves the world a little freer, a little more humane. Che Guevara as a global icon, from myth to memory. As the decades passed, Che's presence continued to ripple across generations. In the 1980s and 90s, his image became an emblem of resistance far beyond Latin America, a universal symbol of defiance against injustice. In Paris, students scrawled his face on protest walls. In Tokyo, activists pinned his beret to their jackets during demonstrations. In South Africa, the young fought apartheid with his words echoing in their hearts. He was no longer confined to history books. He had become a living idea, a quiet whisper of courage that crossed borders, languages, and cultures. But the global fascination with Che was not merely aesthetic or symbolic. It was ethical. People were drawn to the authenticity of his life, a man who lived what he preached. Unlike leaders who sought comfort, power, or admiration, Che's purpose was action itself, guided by principle. His life asked profound questions. How far would you go for justice? How much would you sacrifice for humanity? What does it mean to live fully in alignment with your conscience? In art and culture, his influence evolved. From revolutionary murals to films and music, Che's image inspired creativity that carried ethical weight. He was not just a subject, he was a catalyst. Artists translated his courage into visual language. Poets shaped his struggle into verse, and filmmakers captured the rhythm of his life in motion. And in every depiction, whether faithful or stylized, one truth remained. Che had become larger than the man he once was. Yet the human heart behind the legend continued to resonate. Even in academia, his philosophy was studied with seriousness. Scholars explored his writings on socialism, ethics, and the role of the individual in shaping history. They dissected his reflections on love, sacrifice, and the moral responsibilities of revolution. Students debated his choices, his tactics, his ideals, but always with an acknowledgement of the integrity that fueled them. Che was not a myth to be blindly followed. He was a mirror, forcing each observer to confront their own values, fears, and courage. Yet, as with all icons, there was tension. Some criticized his embrace of armed struggle, questioning the cost of his methods. Others argued that the commercialization of his image diluted his principles. Yet the contradiction only strengthened his significance. It highlighted that true heroism is never simple, never safe, never fully understood. Che's life demanded reflection, not passive admiration. It demanded thought, debate, and most importantly, action. The kind of action that aligns with conscience and humanity. In Cuba, his presence remained tangible. Students visited Santa Clara, stood by his mausoleum, and read his diaries. Teachers recounted stories of his compassion and discipline, emphasizing that the essence of his legacy was moral courage. Across Latin America, his teachings continued to inspire movements for justice, education, and equality. The flame he had lit in the Sierra Maestra had spread, quietly, persistently, across decades and nations. And so Che Guevara became both man and idea. His life, fully human, carried the weight of empathy, courage, and moral clarity. His death, fully human, birthed legend and myth, creating an enduring bridge between reality and inspiration. Every generation that encounters him faces the choice he presented: to act with conscience, to love humanity fiercely, and to embrace sacrifice in the pursuit of justice. Even now, the world feels the pull of his presence. His image smiles silently from murals. His words resonate in classrooms, and his story is whispered in quiet reflections at night. Che Guevara, the man, the revolutionary, the symbol, continues to challenge us to live fully the enduring lessons of Che Guevara. Che Guevara's life is more than a series of events. It is a lesson whispered across time, a quiet invitation to consider the depths of courage, conscience, and compassion. To study Che is to study the choices that define a life, the moments when fear is met with resolve, and the way an individual can bend history not through ambition, but through unwavering principle. His wealth or fame, but the degree to which one aligns action with moral conviction. From his early travels through South America to the jungles of Cuba and the mountains of Bolivia, Che saw the world with an unflinching gaze. He witnessed suffering and oppression, but he did not look away. In each encounter with hunger, disease, or injustice, he discovered not only the pain of others, but the obligation of those who see clearly to act decisively. This became the guiding philosophy of his life. Empathy must be translated into action. Love is meaningful only when it carries sacrifice, and conviction only matters when it manifests in the world. One of the clearest lessons Che left behind is the courage, the discipline to persist when easier paths beckon, the humility to serve rather than dominate. Even when isolated, wounded, or exhausted, Che acted in alignment with his principles. His life demonstrates that heroism is as much internal as it is external. Che also reminds us of the power of education and consciousness. He believed that liberation begins with the mind. The poorest peasant, the weakest fighter, the most overlooked child, all deserved knowledge, awareness, and opportunity. In Cuba, he taught literacy. In the jungles, he educated his comrades about ethics, strategy, and responsibility. He understood that freedom is not merely that demanded the offering of time, energy, and sometimes life itself. His sacrifices were deliberate, not performative. He demonstrated that the truest measure of compassion is the willingness to endure hardship for the sake of others. In his journals, he often reflected on this principle, revealing a man for whom the moral weight of decisions was never taken lightly. Che's life also teaches resilience in the face of adversity. In the jungles of Cuba and the forests of Bolivia, in the sweltering heat and the biting cold, he pressed forward when others faltered. He endured hunger, disease, wounds, and betrayal with a steady heart. From this, we learn that persistence, guided by purpose, to embrace responsibility, and to care for humanity without compromise. In every decision, every act, every word, he teaches that the small, consistent expressions of principle accumulate into profound impact. The enduring lessons of Che Guevara. Che Guevara's teachings extend beyond revolution and battlefields. They dwell in the quiet corners of human conscience. His life is a meditation on integrity, on aligning thought, word, and action. He demonstrated that morality is not abstract but lived, that ideals are not merely to be admired but enacted. In every village he visited, every comrade he guided, and every patient he treated, he left behind a model of deliberate, principled living, a template for anyone seeking to navigate the tension between justice and practicality. One of the most profound lessons he offers is the courage to confront discomfort and uncertainty. Che willingly stepped into dangerous situations, knowing the odds were stacked against him. Yet fear never dictated his choices. In this, he teaches us that true bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Whether in revolutionary struggle or in daily life, the essence of courage remains the same: to follow one's conscience, even when the path is lonely or treacherous. Che also illuminates the importance of selflessness in leadership. He refused privileges, lived simply, and treated others with unwavering respect. His power was not imposed, it was earned through example. To lead, he believed, is not to dominate, but to inspire, to elevate, and to nurture. Leadership, in Che's vision, is a mirror of the soul, reflecting discipline, empathy, and unwavering moral clarity. His life challenges us to consider: how do our choices affect those we guide, influence, or touch? Education and consciousness, again, emerge as central pillars of his philosophy. Che understood that knowledge empowers, liberates, and transforms. In the mountains and villages, he insisted on literacy and critical thinking, nurturing not only soldiers, but conscious human beings. From this, we learn that lasting change begins with awareness, and that every effort to enlighten, to teach, and to elevate another mind is a revolutionary act in itself. Perhaps most poignantly, Che teaches the endurance of ideals. He understood that progress is often slow, resistance is constant, and setbacks inevitable. Yet he never wavered. He demonstrated that a life lived with conviction leaves an imprint far greater than mere survival. Even in death, his presence endures, not as a ghost, but as a moral compass, challenging future generations to align their lives with courage, love, and purpose. His life is a reminder that the truest revolutions occur not just in politics or society, but within the human heart. Each act of kindness, each decision guided by conscience, each refusal to remain indifferent in the face of injustice, continues his work. Che's story whispers to us, softly but insistently, to live meaningfully is to embrace responsibility, to act with compassion, and to persist in the pursuit of justice, no matter the cost. And so, Che Guevara's enduring lesson is both simple and profound. Life is measured not by comfort or acclaim, but by the depth of our commitment to what is right, the courage to act, and the love we extend to others. His legacy remains like a quiet flame, illuminating the path for Che Guevara in culture and memory. Even as the years drifted into decades, Che Guevara's presence remained vivid in the world's imagination. His life and death were no longer merely historical events. They had become a cultural heartbeat, a rhythm that pulsed quietly through art, literature, music, and collective memory. The man who had walked the mountains and jungles now lived on in murals, and yet it was not just his image that endured, but the moral weight carried in every action he had taken, every principle he had embodied. From the streets of Havana to the alleyways of Paris, Che's face appeared as a symbol, instantly recognizable, impossible to ignore. The photograph by Alberto Corda, the beret tilted, the gaze steady and unflinching, became an icon across generations. It was reproduced endlessly, stamped onto walls, t-shirts, and banners. But the true power of the image lay not in replication, but in the story behind it. The life of a man who dared to live fully, who risked everything in the pursuit of justice and dignity. Artists found in Che a muse, and they shaped him into countless interpretations. Painters infused his likeness with bold color and shadow, capturing both strength and humanity. Poets translated his struggles into verse, emphasizing the courage, empathy, and philosophy that defined him. And in each expression, audiences glimpsed not just a revolutionary, but a human being who carried the weight of conscience with grace and determination. Che's cultural impact extended into music and literature too. Songs spoke of his courage, novels told stories of his campaigns, and biographies explored both the man and the myth. even when interpreted differently. Celebrated by some, critiqued by others. His presence continued to spark dialogue, reflection, and inspiration. People did not just remember Che, they engaged with him, wrestled with his ideals, and allowed his story to challenge their own values. In schools and universities, his life became a lens through which students explored ethics, politics, and human rights. They read his letters, debated his strategies, and analyzed his writings, not simply to understand history, but to confront their own understanding. Che became a teacher beyond the battlefield, instructing silently through example on what it means to align one's life with conscience. Even in popular culture, Che's influence resonated deeply. His image adorned streets, clothing, and media, becoming an emblem of resistance for youth movements, activists, and thinkers across continents. While commercialization occasionally diluted his principles, the underlying power of his story persisted. It reminded the world that integrity, courage, and compassion could coexist, and that one individual could ignite hope in the hearts of many. Through all these expressions, from art to activism, from literature to murals, Che's life became a mirror. And so, even decades after his death, Che Guevara remained both man and myth, alive in memory and culture, not as a static symbol, but as a living question, a whisper to every generation to embrace courage, conscience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Che Guevara in culture and memory. As time unfolded, Che Guevara's legacy continued to evolve, not just in politics or history, but in the collective imagination of people across the world. In classrooms, streets, and homes, his name carried a resonance that transcended ideology. He was no longer merely a revolutionary. He became a symbol of moral courage, of the enduring struggle for justice, and of the human capacity to act with conscience, even when faced with insurmountable odds. In Latin America, Che's story remained deeply rooted in the cultural fabric. In Cuba, he was revered, not only for his role in the revolution, but for the principles he exemplified: discipline, empathy, and sacrifice. His writings were studied, his speeches analyzed, and his example cited as a model of integrity. Across the continent, youth movements invoked his image during protests, rallies, and educational campaigns. To them, Che was a reminder that courage is active, that change is possible, and that a single life committed to justice can echo across nations. Che's influence also reached far beyond Latin America. In Europe, Asia, and Africa, his photograph, writings, and story inspired people to challenge systems of inequality and oppression. Young activists carried his image as a badge of ethical defiance, while scholars dissected his philosophy, exploring the tension between revolutionary action and moral responsibility. In this way, Che became a bridge between culture and conscience, between artistry and activism. Artists continued to reinterpret him, finding new ways to convey both his human vulnerabilities and his unwavering ideals. Murals depicted him smiling or in thoughtful repose, while literature examined his internal struggles and ethical reflections. Music memorialized his courage, capturing the rhythm of struggle and the quiet humanity beneath it. Through these cultural expressions, Che remained alive, not in body, but in spirit, guiding those who sought meaning in the pursuit of justice. Even the commercialization of his image could not erase the essence of his legacy. Though t-shirts, posters, and merchandise spread his face worldwide, those who looked closer saw more than a graphic. They saw a man who had lived deliberately, who had risked everything for principle, and whose life continues to pose profound questions. What are we willing to sacrifice for justice? How do we act when the world seems indifferent? How do we live fully in alignment with our values? In every culture, in every generation, Che became a mirror, reflecting both aspiration and challenge. He reminded people that ideals demand effort, that courage is rarely comfortable, and that the impact of a single life can outlast decades, continents, and even death itself. His memory whispers in quiet ways, in conversations about justice, in the decisions we make, in the courage we summon when facing our own mountains. And so, Che Guevara exists in the space between reality and myth. He is the soldier, the thinker, the teacher, and the moral compass. He is the photograph, the mural. Che Guevara's legacy today, reflections for a new generation. Decades after his death, the story of Che Guevara continues to inspire, challenge, and provoke reflection. His life, lived with unwavering conviction, is a compass for those navigating the complexities of the modern world. To encounter Che is to confront the tension between ideals and reality, between courage and comfort, and between conscience and convenience. His legacy is not a static monument. It is a living guide, whispering lessons for each generation that seeks purpose, justice, and meaning. In today's world, where inequality, oppression, and injustice persist, Che's message remains startlingly relevant. He reminds us that awareness alone is not enough. Empathy must be coupled with action. To see suffering and remain indifferent is to abandon the most fundamental duty of our shared humanity. His life illustrates that true engagement requires sacrifice, courage, and the willingness to challenge systems that perpetuate harm. For young activists, thinkers, and dreamers, Che represents the possibility of aligning personal conviction with social responsibility. His example demonstrates that even in the face of overwhelming obstacles, it is possible to live deliberately and act ethically. Modern movements for climate justice, human rights, and equality echo his call that change is not the work of bystanders, but of those who step forward with conscience as their guide. Che's ideals also extend beyond politics. His insistence on education, critical thinking, and moral reflection offers lessons for anyone seeking to live with integrity. In classrooms, students analyze his writings not merely as historical documents, but as guides to ethical decision-making. His life encourages reflection on how we treat others, how we confront injustice, and how we cultivate courage in the small choices of everyday life. Even as his image appears globally, on murals, clothing, and digital media, the essence of his legacy cannot be commodified. The power of Che lies not in the replication of his likeness, but in the adoption of his principles. To embrace his story fully is to consider the ways one can live with empathy, act with courage, and pursue justice, no matter the scale of one's efforts. Che's enduring relevance is also a call to honesty and self-examination. He challenges each individual to reflect. Are my actions aligned with my values? Am I willing to confront fear, discomfort, or societal pressure in the pursuit of what is right? In this way, Che's life is not a relic of the past, but a mirror for the present, urging each of us to measure our own choices against the measure of conscience. And so, for a new generation standing at the intersection of history and possibility, Che Guevara remains both guide and inspiration. His life teaches that ideals require action, that love demands sacrifice, and that courage is the willingness to live fully in alignment with conscience. In the quiet moments of reflection, his story whispers to the heart, reminding us that the path of integrity is never easy, but it is always meaningful. Che Guevara's legacy today, reflections for a new generation. As the world changes, Che Guevara's lessons remain timeless. In cities filled with noise and distraction, his life stands as a quiet beacon, urging reflection on what it means to live purposefully. The challenges we face today, inequality, oppression, environmental crises, and social injustice, call for the same courage, empathy, and moral clarity that defined his journey. Che's example reminds us that meaningful action begins within, a choice to see, to feel, and to act even when the cost is high. In contemporary activism, his influence is unmistakable. Young people organize, march, and speak out, echoing the spirit of commitment Che embodied. His words inspire not only resistance, but integrity. To act thoughtfully, to educate oneself and others, and to maintain empathy for those whose suffering may not be immediately visible. Che teaches that revolution is not only in grand gestures, but in the persistence of small, principled acts, carried out with courage and consistency. Che's moral compass also extends into personal life. His insistence on selflessness, honesty, and reflection offers guidance for navigating modern ethical dilemmas. Whether confronting social injustice, making career choices, or engaging in community action, his life demonstrates that each decision carries weight. The pursuit of justice is never confined to history books or classrooms. It lives in daily choices, in how one treats others, and in the willingness to persist in the face of adversity. His legacy challenges the next generation to embrace discomfort, to step beyond convenience, and to act in alignment with conscience. In a world often dominated by self-interest, Che's example illuminates a different path, one where courage, empathy, and integrity intersect to create lasting impact. He reminds us that to live fully is to embrace both struggle and hope, recognizing that change is possible when guided by moral clarity and action. Even as his face appears on walls, shirts, and digital screens, the enduring power of Che Guevara is not in the symbol, but in the reflection it inspires. His story encourages us to ask, how will I respond to injustice? How will I cultivate courage in my own life? How will I act with love, sacrifice, and commitment in the face of challenge? These questions, whispered through history, remain as urgent now as they were in the mountains of Cuba and the jungles of Bolivia. And so Che's legacy lives on, not as a distant icon, but as a guide for anyone willing to listen. His life demonstrates that integrity, compassion, and courage are not abstract ideals, but attainable ways of being. For the new generation, he is a quiet mentor, a reminder that the measure of life is not in comfort or acclaim, but in the depth of one's commitment to justice, the empathy one extends to others, and the courage to act when it matters most. And as the world moves forward, Che's story continues to whisper softly, urging us all to live deliberately, love fiercely, and act with unwavering conscience. This completes the chapter breakdown and summaries for your script.